Okay, welcome back. And our next item looks at the SQA Higher History Review 2024. Can I welcome our witnesses, Jenny Gilruth, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Claire Hicks, Director, Education Reform, Scottish Government, Fiona Robertson, Chief Executive, Scottish Qualifications Authority, and Martin Weir, Director of Policy, Analysis and Standards at the Scottish Qualifications Authority. You will know you've been called here today by members to answer a number of questions that we have. I know Cabinet Secretary and Ms Robertson, you've both asked to make opening statements. If you are happy to forgo that, we can go straight to members' questions. If not, I will be extremely strict on the time limit.
Convener.
Okay.
That's helpful to the committee. Yep.
Excellent. No, because we've got a lot to get through. Cabinet Secretary, can I start with you? Given everything you know about this year's higher history exam, concerns from students, from teachers, from markers, and having looked at this review, do you have full confidence in Fiona Robertson and the way she and the SQA have handled this?
Yes, I do, and I think worthwhile. I know I've not had time to give an opening statement yet, Convener, but I do think worthwhile, first of all, putting on the record how seriously I take this as Cabinet Secretary. You know, this has been an issue that's been ongoing for a number of months, and I recognise the concerns that have been raised by history teachers. I think it was quite right and proper that the SQA interrogated the evidence and carried out a fulsome review. I'm sure members of the committee have looked and read that review in detail. It makes a number of recommendations about next steps, but it also looks at the process that was adhered to this year. And I'm going to be very careful not to stray into operational matters that are for SQA, but I recognise challenges were presented. I think it was right that the SQA investigated those challenges. There is a fulsome body in terms of the report here of findings around about the approach that's been applied by the SQA this year. I have myself looked as well at the exam paper. I was an SQA marker previously, though not a history marker, and I recognise some of the concerns that have been raised by the profession. However, I hope that the committee has looked at the findings from the report itself, and I might bring in Fiona to talk to some of the evidence.
In a moment, but given that you accept that this has been ongoing for months, the feedback from students, from teachers, from markers and from some whistleblowers within the SQA is one of dismay with this report. But you are content this report is the end of the matter and you have full confidence in the way this has been handled by Ms Robertson and the SQA.
So, can I ask you, Mr Ross, which part of the report you do not agree with?
Well, I'm saying very clearly, Cabinet Secretary, Cabinet Secretary, if I can ask the question, if you answer it, I'm saying very clearly concerns have been raised with me as an MSP, and I know others, from students, from teachers, from markers and from people within the SQA who are unhappy with this. And I'm giving their view, not my own personal opinion at the moment. Given all of that, are you still content that this review is the end of the matter and Fiona Robertson has your full 100% confidence?
Look, I think we need to look at the outcome from this year's examination results for higher history, which of course dropped by 13% in terms of the pass rate. Now, notable drops in relation to the pass rate happen every year, and of course they happen in a range of different subject areas. Fiona can give you details, for example, of other areas in which that has happened. But it is the responsibility of the SQA, first of all, to consider where complaints have arisen, and that is what they have done. They have carried out this investigation. I'm not going to talk to the detail of that and the methodology. I think it's quite right that the SQA does that. And of course, that was independently peer reviewed by the Welsh Qualifications Authority Director, and I'm sure we may come on to that in Q&A.
But you believe this is the end of the matter? There's nothing further for you? I know there's a study with the Scottish Association of History Teachers that concludes at the end of this week. But at the moment, you're telling us as a committee you are content with the findings of this report and the way this has been handled by Ms Robertson and the SQA?
I am content with this report, Mr Ross. And I do want to just follow up the point you made. I think there relates to the Scottish Association for History Teachers.
Yes.
I was very keen, and I had some correspondence from a number of history teachers which referenced SATH. I was very keen to hear views from SATH. So I have said, though the Government accepts the findings of the review, I am very keen to work with the history profession on this. I'm keen to hear feedback from them to that end too. It's hugely important they're part of this process and what comes next.
And how has that been disseminated to them? Because I've certainly had, since it was announced that the committee had called you both here today, history teachers saying they had no knowledge of this, and there's some concerns that that has not been disseminated as widely as it could be.
So SATH is the professional association that represents history teachers in Scotland. Not all history teachers will be a member of SATH. The reason that I have sought to engage with them is purely based on the correspondence I have received from history teachers. I asked my officials to engage to that end, I think last week, but I may bring in Claire on that point, and I'm happy for this to be distributed more widely to the history teaching profession to hear views. It is important also for you to reflect, Convener, not all history teachers have the same view as those that you've espoused today. And I hope that the committee has refreshed itself with the publication of a report, or an article rather, that appeared in the Times Educational Supplement
I'm
yesterday.
very keen to come on to that, actually, so I'll maybe raise that. Ms Hicks, is there anything you want to say?
Just in relation, the survey that SATH is undertaking is obviously a matter for them, but both the SQA and Scottish Government will be keen to speak to them once they have considered that survey and concluded it in the normal course that we would engage with.
And that can be shared with the committee?
That would entirely be a matter for SATH to take forward. It's their survey.
But you've asked for it, so it's been shared?
No, that's absolutely not the...
OK, so is the feedback coming back to you? I was told by the 6th, yes, by the 6th of December it closes and feedback goes back to you.
Sorry, Convener, my understanding is they've also, as an organisation, undertaken to have their own survey. That's not something I've commissioned. We've asked for feedback. OK, so if you would be happy to share that feedback with the committee? Happy to do so.
Thank you. Ms Robertson, are you content that, after all that pupils and staff have been through, that ultimately you lay the blame at falling standards with students? That's where you think the blame lies, and there is no blame at all allocated to you or the SQA?
I don't think the report or the work that we've done seeks to lay blame anywhere.
It does.
I think what the report, the responsibilities we have as an awarding body, and the responsibilities I have as Chief Examiner to...
Sorry, page 2 of the report, paragraph 8, states that overwhelmingly it was the poor standard of responses provided by the learners in this year's examination led to a 13.1% drop. Please don't come to this committee and say your report is not saying it when it's on page 2, paragraph 8 of your report. Ms Robertson. I
think what I was trying to say was that the report and the review into higher history was seeking to be evidence-based. And what we have a responsibility to do as an awarding body is to award qualifications on the basis of the performance of learners. That the evidence that we have laid out in the report reflects the evidence that we have gained through the awarding process, and that includes the feedback of markers who are teachers working in schools across Scotland and have provided feedback on the standard that they saw through the marking process. Every subject that we award, and on results day we award around 140 national qualifications courses, so those are the graded courses that we award on results day. Every single one of those courses reflects the performance of individual learners. If individual learners meet the standard of our qualifications, then they achieve those qualifications. If they do not, they do not. That's not laying blame. That's seeking to ensure that our qualification system is based on an understanding of the national standard and that we award qualifications on merit. There have been very serious questions raised in relation to higher history this year. Those questions I have treated very seriously, and that is the reason why I commissioned this review. And the review was commissioned by me and undertaken by my colleagues within our existing structures and responsibilities. So it was the right thing for us to do, given the questions that we raised.
Why didn't you launch the review straight away? Why did it take you till the 11th of September? Surely Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure, looked at the figures coming in. Surely you looked at the figures coming in and thought, why has there been a 13.1% drop in higher history this year? And you knew there was complaints. It seems to be because there was a bit of backlash, both politically here in Parliament and on social media. You launched that review. Why not launch it the day you saw these figures coming in?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's a general point I'd like to make around variability, and then I'll talk about...
I'm just keen to get to members' questions. So why not launch it when you saw these figures? Well,
first of all, variability in attainment is not unusual. We don't have a fixed attainment rate, a fixed A to C attainment rate across our courses, so you will see variation. So, for example, this year in higher applications of maths, we saw a 13.3% decline in A to C. This year in higher RMPS, we saw a 7.1% increase in A to C. We see variability
in the migration in the Migration in Europe paper. The marks changed by 26%, down 26% on 2019.
Yeah.
That is a huge drop that surely you, as the head of the SQA, saw minus 26%. Look, someone's got to look into this, but you didn't. You waited until there was controversy raised in this building by parliamentarians and teachers were speaking up on social media to launch a review. And I don't understand what took you so long.
So I've highlighted that there are variability in attainment, and that's important. It's important for the committee to understand that.
Yep.
In relation to higher history itself, you're right that there were changes in marking. There were changes in the marks that learners achieved between years, and as part of our awarding processes, we consider those issues. So during the grade boundary process, for example...
We'll come on to that in a moment. You still haven't... I'm sorry, I'm asking a very simple question. What was the gap between you getting these results and knowing that on one of the papers, the number of marks allocated dropped by 26% and launching a review that lasted 2 months on the 11th of September? Can you just answer that? And if not, we'll move on to other members. On results day, I was confident and remain confident about the results that we published. Wow, okay.
Okay. And however, I recognise the importance, and as I'm sure the committee does, I recognise the importance of the integrity of our qualifications and the public confidence in our qualifications. And I took the view, therefore, given the sustained criticism in relation to higher history, it was therefore important, and I had a responsibility to undertake the review that we have, and that is what we did.
Okay, thank you.
And in doing so, and the reason that it took the length of time that it did, that I felt it was important, and the authors of the report felt it was important, that we considered this in the context of our end-to-end awarding processes. And in relation to answering your questions, that's what I've been trying to outline. We have checks and balances in our awarding processes, right from the start of devising qualifications, devising the exam papers, right through to results day, and the publication of course reports, which do provide feedback to teachers, and our understanding standards events. We have a complex and a rightfully complex process in place to provide confidence in the integrity of our qualifications. And it was therefore right that we undertook this review and that we considered it in the context of our
I don't know why it wasn't right
processes.
to do it the day the exam results came out. That's the bit I'm struggling to understand. Finally, because a lot of other members want to come in, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned this article in Test last night, authored by SQA Principal Assessor for Higher History and SQA Senior Team Leader for Higher History. This is a great defence of you, Ms Robertson. Is it just a coincidence that it came out the night before you were appearing before this committee?
It's not a coincidence.
It's not a coincidence. So this is a orchestrated effort to get this into the public domain before you come here today to answer from MSPs. Well, yes or no?
The timing of the publication of the article was not down to me. The precise timing.
You just said it was coordinated ahead of you coming to committee.
Well, there has been following the publication of the report. There has been anonymous commentary in relation to teachers and others commenting on this report, and discussions with the principal assessor and the team leader. They were keen, in their view, to put the record straight.
Hours before you came to committee.
They were happy to set that out.
Interesting. Okay. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Thank you for the responses we've had so far. As all of you will be aware, I'm concerned about this issue, not least because of the impact that it has had on some students. but also because of the long-term implications it could have for trust in the system. And we've heard from some teachers and pupils that the results of the report that have come out, and I'll quote some, they've said it was a gut punch, it was insulting, they felt people had suffered injustice, and it means there's a lack of trust. One teacher said, "I can't help but feel completely let down by the results of this report, which, although disappointing, is not surprising. Having taught higher for 8 years, I was until this year confident in my ability to teach to the standard required. This year has not been the same. Consistent mixed messages from colleagues who are markers, the SQA and understanding standards materials has meant I'm no longer feeling this way and unable to instil confidence in my students." Those comments are why we're here and why it's really important that we set out on the record today what's happened. So can I ask my first question, if that's all right, to Cabinet Secretary? Did you instruct the review and did you ask that it should be independent?
No, I did not instruct the review.
Why not?
Because I think, as the Chief Examiner has answered, that matter is a matter for the qualifications body in the first instance. And of course, the review has now completed. Is it now the view from the member that I should instruct an independent inquiry into the report?
It was always my view that the Cabinet Secretary for Education should intervene when there's a 26% drop in attainment in one subject. Yes.
I presume then that you have looked in detail, Ms Duncan Glancy, at the content of this report, because I have not yet been presented with an evidence base to substantiate my instructing the Chief Examiner to lead an independent review. If you have that evidence base, I am happy to consider it. I have also asked SAF for further follow-up, but in my reading of this report, I have not been presented with that. And I have to go back to the point the convener made about variation in pass rates. Is the point that the committee is trying to make here that if the pass rate varies by 13% in 1 year, we should automatically have reviews into every subject?
With respect, Cabinet Secretary, I think you're really missing the point.
I don't.
I think the matter here is, I have to say, I'm sorry, I think you are. The matter here is not so much about if there's this cut-off rate, do we do this? The disconnect between what's happening between pupils and teachers and the SQA is ever growing, and the gulf of distrust is widening, and that is the problem here. And it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately, that that continues when the Cabinet Secretary can't accept that. So I asked that you asked me if I'm now saying would you instruct an independent review. My question was, when you noticed this change and when you started to hear that there were concerns, did you ask the qualifications body to look into it? And
yes.
Are you happy that they used their own staff, spoke to their own teachers who are markers to do that, and have produced a report that you think doesn't protect the system as it was?
So the member asked if I instructed the review itself. I did not, and of course the Chief Examiner can answer for herself on that point. I did meet with the Chief Examiner on 3 occasions throughout the duration of the review, as I was concerned, because as members around this table will know, I was receiving the same correspondence that MSP was receiving. So I was concerned at the outset, and I wanted to understand what had happened. We can talk about variation in the round. Variation happens every year in terms of pass marks, and it happens in a variety of different subjects. But what I was hearing from the profession and from some parents was that there was an issue specifically with higher history and paper 2 this year. And I wanted to be absolutely certain that that was not the case. And of course, the SQA is quite right, investigated that matter. Now, the member asked about SQA using their own staff to do that. Of course, the staff that you're talking to, Ms Duncan Glancy, are practising teachers, many of whom are markers for the SQA. So these are all not people
all of whom are working for the SQA as part of that then? They might also be working in schools, but they're also part of the SQA process. Was anyone who wasn't part of the process? And therefore they can't provide objectivity? Is that the point that you're making, Mr. I think it's a question to be asked.
I think that's probably one best directed to Ms Robertson in the first instance, although I'm happy to come back to that point on independence and how we can give that objectivity, because I think it is a fair point.
Can I just...
An independence, then we'll go to Ms Robertson.
Well, of course, I think it relates...
From Ms Robertson first?
I think so, and then to set
OK,
the context.
right, well, if you need to hear from her first. Ms Robertson.
So within SQA, we have a Directorate of Policy Analysis and Standards, and the Director of Policy Analysis and Standards is with me, Martin Ware, and we have a Head of Standards. We have a responsibility to ensure standards are maintained over time. So that work, the work that was done within SQA, was undertaken independently within SQA. So it did not involve... the review was not undertaken by individuals that had been involved in the awarding process, and that's important. That's important. And we do have we do have that functional responsibility to undertake that work, and that's what we've done. However, it was important that we also were able to stress test and also seek some external review, and that's why we involved WJC in that work. I think quite a lot of the debate around this issue has actually been a debate between teachers, and I acknowledge that there's a strength of view, absolutely, among some teachers. In fact, amongst all teachers, there's a strength of view, but there's also a variety of views on this issue, including those very strongly held views which have integrity of the principal assessor and the senior marker. I was aware that whatever conclusions this report reached, there would not be unanimity of view of teachers, whether they work for SQA as markers or appointees or not. And I think it's really important that we don't seek to divide teachers into those that mark for SQA and those that don't. 10,000 teachers, it's a very significant number of teachers mark for SQA, and most teachers mark for SQA during their career. And I'd like to see more mark for SQA during their career. But at the heart of what this review was about was a review of marking. Therefore, the focus of our energies, unsurprisingly, was therefore in understanding and seeking to ensure that we understood the evidence base and the issues and the complexity of the issues that are contained in the report in relation to the marking process. And that's why our focus was very much in particular in relation to marking and markers. It was important that we did that.
I understand that. Do you think then at any part in the process at all you should have spoken to people who have not been part of the marking process that you've oversaw? So you said yourself it was a review that was undertaken internally by the SQA. Do you not think that it would have been helpful to speak with people who weren't already part of the SQA?
Well, we obviously were aware of some of the commentary that had been... I suppose there's 2 points to make to that. One is that I commissioned the review, and the review was commissioned in such a way that it could be... I may bring Martin in at this point. I asked colleagues to carry out a thorough review, evidence-led review, and it was important that they did so without fear or favour. I think that's really important. The head of standards and Martin did that and had whatever conversations they needed to have to fulfil the commission. And Martin can talk a little bit more about the methodology in so doing. But we did seek the views of WJC. We did review all the commentary that had been provided both by markers and by others as part of the review itself as well. So, Martin, you might want to come in a little bit more on methodology, but there was no strictures, if you like, on methodology in my view. But it was very important that this at its heart was a review of marking, because that was the central proposition in relation to criticism, that the marking standard had changed, and it was therefore right and proper that the review considered issues in relation to the marking standard.
Before then, we hear from Martin Ware, if it's all right. Do you accept that teachers have said that they think there was a change and that there was a lack of communication from your body to teachers on what that change would mean?
I accept that teachers have said what you have said, absolutely. I accept that they have said that. The marking instructions for our assessments, as you would expect, are not released before the examination. What we need to make sure is that our assessments are set within the context of the content of each course and the course specification. That's the key thing. And that the marking instructions that markers are provided with are sufficient, along with our processes, which are laid out in some detail in the report, are sufficient to ensure the integrity and consistency of our marking. What the report says is that for subjects such as history, but also for other subjects where there are extended pieces of writing and perhaps are considered to be more subjective, there are challenges, and that's not just an SQA challenge, that's a challenge that other exam boards face as well. So we have checks and balances in the process to ensure the integrity. The detail in our marking, the detail in the marking instructions, I think we would legitimately be criticised for less detail rather than more detail. What we want to do is we want to provide as much information to our markers to ensure the integrity of our marking. And therefore, the marking instructions are detailed. They're not exhaustive, but they're detailed.
The teachers have said that's not clear. And in the report, as we've heard already, whether you call it blame or otherwise, the explanation the report has given for the drop is that learners didn't perform. How do you explain that? How do you explain that problem?
Well, I think here, this is where the course report, which has been recently published, is helpful, because what it sets out is how learners have responded to the questions that have been asked. And I'm happy to talk through that. But what we do is we publish. Obviously, we will publish a course specification, and that's absolutely the blueprint and the framework, if you like, for how learning and teaching is considered for our courses, and the examination needs to be in the context of that course specification, and we provide marking instructions to assist markers. Now, those marking instructions are subject to discussion, debate, review with markers and the senior team, and that debate can be robust. There's a process. Was it robust this year? Yes. More robust than normal? As robust as it should be. More robust than normal. I spoke to a marker last night who wanted me to know very clearly that concerns were raised after the exams had been sat, but before a single paper had been marked, that markers were being asked to seek a higher standard this year. And they said they made that very clear, and the meeting was very uncomfortable for members of the SQA. Is that fair? I don't think that's what is reflected in the report. I'm less concerned about the report. I'm asking you a question about that meeting and any feedback you got as the head of the SQA about that meeting. Are you saying it was a normal meeting where this is discussed and there was nothing extraordinary about it this year? Yes or no? We've sought feedback on the marker meetings. I wasn't at the marker meeting. I don't think anyone in this room was at the marker meeting. But you're the head of the SQA, and if there are concerns about a marking meeting, I would expect you to know about them. Are you saying no concerns were ever raised at any point, that it was above the normal standard of concerns? No concerns were raised. No concerns were raised. That it was above the. But what those meetings are, and they should be, is a healthy debate around. And Martin can set this out, because obviously we set the assessment, we develop the marking instructions, but we also need to see that live when we get scripts through, and that's a normal part of the process, that there are discussions amongst the marking team to refine the marking instructions, and that, just to make sure that we get it right. So actually a healthy debate amongst teachers, I would see as a good thing. And I would not consider that to be unusual, but we did not get feedback that was anything out of the ordinary. Okay. But Martin can say a little bit more about what's in the report. I'm okay if that's, if the head of the SQA tells me that, I'll accept that evidence. It's contrary to everything I heard last night. But Pam Duncan-Glancy.
On that point about the meeting, I've heard that there were two meetings about this, and in the first meeting it was decided that there wouldn't be a lowering of the grade to take into consideration the difference. And then 4 days later it was decided that there would be. So what changed in the process in those 4 days?
So just for clarity, these are two different meetings. The one I was speaking about was pre-marking, but Pam, I've been seeing the same email as Pam, and Pam was speaking about a separate meeting where legitimate concerns were raised. So we've got as far as we're going to get with that pre-meeting before any papers were marked. I'm very suspicious about the evidence, but I take it at face value. Now, Pam would like to know about the changing of the gradings and what was discussed one day, and then 4 days later, the SQA changed. Yes. So just for clarity, you're talking about the markers meeting? Yes. Yeah. This is the grade boundary discussion, so I'm happy to talk about that. So I oversee the grade boundary process. I don't chair every grade boundary meeting because I can't physically do that in the time that we have. It's a narrow window that we have between the conclusion of the exam diet and the certification process. But I am supported by 2 senior directors, one of whom is to my right. But we also discuss as a team the decisions that we're making around grade boundaries. So this is not about marking, just to be clear, this is not about marking, this is about grade boundaries, which is something different. So we will have discussions about the decisions at individual grade boundary meetings, and bearing in mind on some days there are 15 grade boundary meetings, 3 panels, all running concurrently. So we need to make sure that we're taking consistent decisions across those grade boundaries. This year, with the return of coursework to many of our courses, we, as part of our policy for awarding, were clear that there may be some there may be some consequences to that in relation to attainment. And on that basis, we set out in our awarding policy that we acknowledge that we may need to make some modest grade boundary adjustments in favour of learners. So that means that you're lowering the grade boundary, lowering the boundary at which a learner passes, has either a C pass or an A pass. Cognizant of the fact that coursework was coming back. The first grade boundary meeting for higher history concluded that no changes to grade boundary. Having discussed many of the issues that you discussed today around the performance of the assessments, around the performance of learners, etc. The following morning, I asked the question about whether sufficient consideration had been given to the return of coursework for higher history, and mindful of the fact that we'd seen quite a shift in learner performance, a shift in learner performance which had been fully discussed at the grade boundary meeting, which was not chaired by myself. And it was on that basis that I asked that we consider whether any modest adjustments should be made on the basis of the return of coursework, and crucially consistent with the way that we were treating other courses. And I hope that gives the committee some assurance that we were looking both across as well as within. So we're looking across courses as well as within courses. And it was on that basis that there was a second, that the grade boundary was pulled together for a second time, and there was a modest adjustment made to the grade boundary. So -2, I think it was, at A and C. So,
that's helpful.
Okay. Sorry, I need to move on. Cabinet Secretary, you said you might want to come back in about the independence of who was spoken about, and I've got 2 SNP members who want to come in on that. Do you want to make your okay, Jackie Nabar, then George Adam, then we'll come to you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, and it was about the independence of the review of the. I was just going to ask, has the SQA report been reviewed by another independent person, and if so, who?
Well, I think Fiona may want to speak to the detail and the methodology that was applied, but as the committee will be aware, the report itself was peer-reviewed by Richard Harry, the Executive Director of Qualifications and Assessment in Wales. So he carried out an independent peer review of the report itself, and Fiona can talk to the detail of that, because the methodology around that independent peer review was decided by SQA, not by Scottish Government.
Thank you, Convener. Basically, I'd like to bring this back to the people who are important in all this. It's the young people and the parents who are supporting these young people when they're going through this. As we all know, it's a very kind of traumatic time of their life. And one of the I've been an elected official more years than I care to remember, local level and nationally. And I know when anything happens with exams, parents, the students themselves are on you right away as an elected official. Unlike the Convener, I've not had a Santa's sack load of mail with regards to this issue. But one of the things I would ask you first, Fiona, with regards to the SQA, have you received any complaints from pupils and parents since the appeals process was closed and completed? And the same question to yourself, Cabinet Secretary.
No, I believe not. I have, however, had some correspondence from members of this Parliament.
Right, okay. Cabinet Secretary.
But not from learners or parents.
Because obviously in this situation, Cabinet Secretary, if they're not contacting their local member, they'll be on to you right away, the parents.
Absolutely. I think we've received one since appeals closed.
Right. Okay, no further questions.
Cabinet Secretary, on the independence of the review.
Sorry,
You asked to come back after you'd heard.
I don't think I have anything further to add to the point I made to Mr Barr in relation to the involvement of the Welsh Qualifications Body in this, and of course SQ might want to talk to the detail around about the methodology and how that was commissioned.
We've not really had any questions on that yet. So, Jackie Dunbar, you wanted to come in on a separate point.
Yes, it was following Pam Duncan-Glancy's question. She was saying that teachers have said that there's been a change. So, you know, can I ask Ms Robertson what the difference is between this year's higher history paper and compared to last year's? What's the change? Has there been one?
Well, obviously our exams will change every year, but they're set within the context of the course specification. So it's really what we're seeking to make sure is that we're asking valid questions, which learners and their teachers might anticipate in the context of the course specification.
I think it's the level of questions I was trying to figure out.
Yeah,
if there had been a difference in...
The focus has been particularly, and I think the convener highlighted, the focus has been particularly around the dip in performance in paper 2, which is Scottish history, and in particular the most popular choice, which is around migration and empire. Because there are choices, quite a lot of choice actually in the higher history paper. It's quite a complex paper to set, because particularly for some of the other papers, well, the paper on world and European history, you can choose almost any period of history. So there's lots of choice that learners and their teachers can make in terms of how they engage with the assessments. But that's been the particular focus. History paper, the Scottish paper 2, and in particular the questions in relation to empire and migration. I'm confident that the questions that were asked this year are absolutely consistent with the course specification, and therefore are valid questions to ask.
The point is less so about the questions, surely, than what you allocate marks for. Is that not where the concerns have come, that you are asking for things this year that previously hadn't been requested?
Well, obviously, you are... by definition, if you have a different question, and I'm not trying, just for clarity, if you have a different question, then you're asking for different things in response. So the marking instructions will change year to year because you're asking a different question.
So you've got a number of past papers on the SQA site this morning, and they tell you how you would gain marks.
Yes.
Are all of those relevant for people who sat the exams this summer? Are you confident, sat here in front of this committee today, that the information published on your website for learners and for teachers is accurate in terms of what you would be allocating marks for?
Yes, yes, I'm confident. But what I'm saying, however, is that it's important that that our assessments will vary each year, as you'd expect.
Well, that's understandable. I think what people have trouble with... The
marking instructions, therefore, will be, by definition, different. The marking instructions are designed to help teachers mark, so they need to be sufficiently detailed to ensure the integrity of our marking, whilst not exhaustive. Yeah. However,
but in the report,
there are checks and
the report that you say defends everything the SQA have done, it says on page 33, for example, to explain question for migration and empire needing a name to get a mark, this is different. This is not the same from previous years. You know, in the same block, it's saying the marking standard was much higher than previous years. Page 33 of your own report.
That was a quote from the marker.
Yes, I know, but markers that you listened to form this report. So are you saying even the markers who you quote in your report are wrong?
No, I'm just reflecting the evidence from the feedback from markers. However, I think that the report also highlights, and in relation, and Martin can explain this in far more detail than I can. I think what the report also highlights is that you didn't need to name. You didn't need to name anyone in order to get the mark. And there was further checks done to ensure that we had evidence to support that. Okay. And no, but this is really important. There's also something called marker check right at the end of the process, and that's to ensure that despite all the checks and balances that have gone before, there's a final check before finalisation, before awarding takes place, to ensure that even if a marker did think that the marking standard had changed, and even if a marker had been harsher in their marking, and there's variability in marking, but what we do is we have checks and balances in place to ensure that any adjustments that are required are taken forward. So every marker's marking is checked. And you know, I've not been a marker for SQA, but I have marked exam scripts. And that's a common practice across education, further and higher education too. That's what we do to ensure the integrity of our marking. Can I just say one thing which I think that Mr. Adams has highlighted. We've got a really important role to fulfil, and the interests of learners are at the heart of everything that we do. But we also, and we want learners to do well, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that qualifications reflect the performance of learners, and that's what we've done. Now, I don't think any of us feel happy about the fact that performance has dipped this year, and it's a reasonable issue for this committee, and indeed for teachers, learners, and indeed colleagues across the SQA to discuss. And SQA has had a lot of challenge and scrutiny in recent years. But that debate must be tempered by the 10,000 learners that have undertaken this course this year.
I think the point we need to
And it must also be tempered by those that are preparing for exams next year
or struggling to prepare because they're still waiting to get information. But, you know, that cohort, and this has certainly been put to me, the cohort who have gone through higher history this year with a fall of 13.1%, did not see a similar fall across all the other subjects that they were studying. And I think that's why there are legitimate questions here. Ross Greer.
And I should say from the offset, I'm grateful to Fiona and the SQA for the briefing that they gave to opposition spokespeople on the eve of this being published. Members of Parliament have made it very clear that we wanted more engagement from the SQA in recent years, so we got that. However, this point around variation, exactly as the conveners just made, it's entirely legitimate to say that there's variation every year. Of course there is. The variation on this subject this year was clearly an outlier. Any higher maths student could tell you that this was an outlier. That's why there is concern here. And I welcome the column in TEDS from the Principal Assessor and the team leader. There's plenty in it that I agree with, but the point in their column that I really disagreed with, I think, gets to the core of my concern about the report, and it's about what's not in it, because they say it's not the responsibility of the SQA to look into why there was this drop in performance. Essentially, the SQA's job here with the report, the review, was to quality assure its own processes. And I'm not going to dispute the outcomes of the report in terms of that review. What I want to ask is, if it's not the role of the Chief Examiner to look into why there was such a significant drop in performance, whose role is it? So if we accept the premise, because I think others have covered already the potential issues with the review, but let's, for the purpose of this question, accept the premise. The review has found that there were not issues with either the exam or the marking. Therefore, as has been pointed out already, the conclusion is it was a drop in the performance of students. I feel like the report is only half a report because it then doesn't look into why there was this drop. So if that's not the Chief Examiner's job to look into that, whose is it?
I think I have a responsibility to explain, and that's what the course report does. And we also have a responsibility to ensure that we, with teachers, and this is what we do through Understanding Standards events, is that we're clear about what the standard is, and we're able to exemplify the standard, and we're able to offer support to teachers who are teaching our courses. So I do have a responsibility, and SQA does have a responsibility to explain. And if you look at the course report for this year, it does explain in relation to the migration and empire section some of the issues. And you know, when I spoke to
and so I said the course review explains what the issues are in terms of the answers that came back. The core question here is, why were those the answers coming back? If we accept your premise that the issue here, that the cause of this was underperformance by pupils compared to previous years, yes, your job is to explain the SQA's processes, procedures and quality assurance, and you've done that. Surely your job as Chief Examiner is also to look into why there are these unusual underperformances. Like there was clearly an outlier here. If it's not the job of the Chief Examiner to look into why pupils underperformed to such an extent this year, whose job is it? So I'll rephrase that because that was the first question. Do you think it is your job to understand why pupils underperformed? So setting aside process issues with SQA as an organisation, as Chief Examiner, is it your job to understand why underperformance happens if it is such an outlier like this?
I believe I play a role in explaining what has happened and in explaining how learners are engaging with our so effectively on results day we're providing a snapshot of learner performance or learner performance of those who take our qualifications. But there are wider issues here which SQA does not have a locus on. So, for example, presentation decisions, quality of learning and teaching, the progression of learners. So, about a quarter of learners who undertake higher history do not have a previous qualification in higher history. Now, that's not my decision. The presentation decisions of schools are at the discretion, are at their discretion. So there are a number of things that I can't fully explain. However, we do have evidence. Obviously, we hold evidence. SQA actually holds a lot of really useful evidence about how learners are, how many learners are being presented, and how they're engaging with our qualifications. But I'll give you. I mean, just by way of an example, if the course report highlights, for example, in relation to one of the questions on empire and migration, that many gave examples of pull factors when the question asked for push factors. We can't give you marks if you answer a question if you're answering a different question. So I guess while I accept that there have been issues. There clearly has been a shift in performance in higher history this year.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a core point. Because I accept on that specific example, you cannot give marks for an answer that is not to the question that was asked. So I accept what you're saying there, having not got the depth of knowledge of the paper. Based on what you said, I accept that. So I suppose my comment, though, is to the Cabinet Secretary that the SQA's report, which has been externally quality assured by the Welsh equivalent body, I accept that. The SQA's report is about quality assuring its own processes. Based on the conclusions it's come to, that the issue is not with either the exam paper or the marking scheme, and the issue is an unusual underperformance of pupils. If it's not the role of the Chief Examiner to look into why, so these questions of presentation, etc., where in the system does that responsibility lie? Whose responsibility is it to look into that further?
So I think ultimately, to Mr Greer's question, Scottish Government and local authorities, we in law have responsibility for improvement in Scottish education, and I accept my role in that. I think, though, the point that Fiona was making around about over-presentation is a key theme in the report, which I know committee members will all have read. But that, throughout the report, looks at young people potentially sitting a qualification at a level they might not have been ready for, and that perhaps impacts on their performance. So I think we do need to look at that issue specifically. I'm very keen to speak to the Chief Inspector about this and how we can support that, working with local authorities. The committee will be aware of the improvement work that's already ongoing in terms of the curriculum improvement cycle. But the other point I'm mindful of is longer term. I don't want a repeat of what we've had this year, and I want our young people and our parents and our teachers to have confidence in our qualification system. So I'm mindful of the committee's report, and I'm mindful that we will have a debate in 2 weeks' time. I give an offer on the record today that I'd be happy to meet with any committee members on ideas they may have, but I'm particularly mindful of the role of accreditation in this and how we can give that confidence to the system that there is an independence of thought in terms of applying that regulation to the qualifications. Now, that's something I will need to consider as Cabinet Secretary, but I am mindful of this process and us learning lessons through the reform process. I think that's so important. Our new qualifications body has to carry the trust, to the point that Ms Duncan Glancy was making, the trust of Scotland's teachers, pupils and parents. And it's really imperative that we consider too, I think, the role of continuous assessment, which is live in terms of my recommendations on Professor Hayward's review. Arguably, if we had a process of continuous assessment, which incidentally we did have, then you wouldn't have such a level of over-presentation. In fact, I remember sitting where Ms Dunbar is asking Fiona this exact question, probably in 2019. So because we don't have continuous assessment at the current time, you arguably have an over-presentation. It's difficult to quantify that. But I do think one of the recommendations from Hayward, going back to look at continuous assessment, is the answer here. I think it will help to drive better improvement. It will help to support and scaffold young people in terms of preparation for that qualification. The third point is just in terms of accreditation and next steps. And of course, I'm very mindful of the role of SAF in all of this, and listening to their feedback from this will be really imperative, I think, to where we go next.
Thanks very much.
Just on that argument, if that is one of the arguments that you believe could be a cause that, you know, too many people are taking history and they haven't done the preparation, why then such a fall this year? You know, if you go back again, the report, page 36 is very clear. Attainment, 2015, 85%, 16, 87%, 83%, 83%, 73%, 78, 78, and then the fall to 66. Why would that be the case just this year and not the last couple of years?
Well, it's obviously very difficult for me as Cabinet Secretary to point to one
but
factor.
you're using that as a
report
potential
itself,
reason.
of course. Well, in the report itself, I think if you look at page 10, it talks to the qualification changes in recent years, and it also makes a point around about history in particular not having been consistent in terms of the qualifications requirements since 2018.
Yeah,
is that right?
But
so there have been changes to the qualifications.
But just last year,
as a result.
78% were getting between A and C.
Yes, but last year there would have been a different approach taken because it was still, in terms of the COVID approaches during the pandemic, that was still being applied to it. So a more lenient approach, I think, was being applied last year. Fiona may want to speak to the detail on that.
Over the last 5 years, there have been changes both to the structure of assessment. There have been changes to both the structure of assessment and the awarding approach post-pandemic.
Yeah, no, I do. In fairness, I do understand that. It was just more the point to the Cabinet Secretary.
I think that therefore sets in context the point you make about comparisons, and I don't want to overstate it. But I think we need to be careful about drawing. So we have seen shifts in attainment across other courses as well. I'm not seeking to diminish what we're talking about here, but I think it's important that we don't either over or understate what we're seeing.
I've still got a lot of members that want to come in. Ross, you want to just briefly?
Hopefully this is just a yes/no question, Convener. It's about the communication with the profession. Am I right in understanding that there is no way for you to directly communicate with everyone who teaches history in Scotland? You can communicate with schools, with subject specialist associations and with your own markers, but there's no mailing list of every history teacher in Scotland at present.
That's my understanding. I mean, we have contact with the association and through other and the events that we hold, so that there are mechanisms that we do and can use, and that's something that we're looking at in the context of our engagement with subject specialists across the spectrum. So that's something that we're keen to do more of. But there's good engagement that goes on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely.
But
I think that's something to consider for the wider reform programme, not just for history.
No, I think that's fair.
Thank you. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Confidence and trust in the exam system really does matter, and this internal investigation hasn't restored that trust. I think we all need to admit that. It's actually undermined it even more, I think. And so I wondered, in terms of where, and we see this all online, the SQA marking their own homework, this being a whitewash, how do you move on from this? And maybe put that to the Cabinet Secretary first.
Well, I think the member raises a really important point, Convener, because I go back to, I think, the issue I was raising earlier. It's imperative the new qualifications body and the SQA has the trust of Scotland's teachers and pupils and parents. And obviously this has been a challenging time in terms of some of the coverage. Opinions vary, though, and differ in terms of some of the outputs here. And the member makes points in terms of the report. The report puts substantive evidence to its recommendations, and I think it is difficult to challenge the content of the report. And what I have not heard today from the committee is any challenge to the content in the report. If, after this committee session, the committee hears evidence from people who might get in contact with the committee, I'm more than happy to consider that. But at the current time, the report does not provide me with an evidence base for us to look at anything further. So I think that was the point that Ms Duncan Glancy was referring to earlier on. We have to work with Scotland's teachers. And I was a teacher before, as you all know, and I was a marker. And I think the point was made in the committee earlier about the disconnect often between the qualifications body and being at the chalk face. And I think being a marker is actually a really important thing to do, particularly as a secondary teacher, to have an understanding of the national standard, but also an opportunity to contribute to what the national standard looks like. It informs better practice, in my view, and I think it can help to support better learning and teaching. So I think we need to look at opportunities for the teaching profession to be involved in the new qualifications body so that they do not feel it is an organisation that does things to them. And I know that in the past that was often the feeling from the profession. I speak from personal experience. I think it's really important they have those professional opportunities to engage with the new qualifications body, to be part of it, so that they own the qualifications process as much as anything else.
I take in Pam just for a second because she just wanted to come in on that point.
Thank you. It was just to say, Cabinet Secretary, that my point earlier wasn't that would you now do an independent review, although that is a question I think that's legitimate. It was more that when you saw all this happening before the SQA did the review, did you ask them to do an independent review? No, I did not, and I answered that question previously.
Current history teachers who marked the exam have said they're confused, they're demoralised, that those in charge of assessments have effectively destroyed the subject. Now, Fergus Ewing, your colleague Cabinet Secretary, has also said this has been a fatally flawed process. So I just wondered where we are today and what has been an investigation. The Cabinet Secretary has a power to regulate procedures under SQA. She's saying she's happy enough with this and we need to move on. But would you not consider that this hasn't answered these questions, that there's a lot of people out there who will not want to be markers any longer, a lot of people not confident in the next history exam, and for pupils and parents, I think that's what's really angering them, that people going to sit the next exam with all this will not have confidence, and that we need some other way of having a new independent investigation to look at this, not an internal process. I take on board what you've said about the Welsh being involved. But this hasn't cleared this up, and I'm not quite sure if the Cabinet Secretary just thinks time will mean this moves on and people just have to live with this, or actually this really presents at the heart of the SQA a problem. So I wondered where the Cabinet Secretary is taking that advice from her own colleagues who aren't happy at this process.
So I thank the member for his question. I very much recognise the strength of feeling in relation to this matter. It's quite unusual, of course, that the qualifications body would instruct a review of this nature. Sure. In my experience, I'm not sure if it's happened previously in other subject areas. So it is quite unique. Not for many, many years. So it is quite unique. But I take on board the point the member makes. The issue I have as Cabinet Secretary, though, is that the report I've been presented with does not substantiate any evidence base for me to issue a directive, and I think that's the point the member is making. So if that evidence base exists, I will consider it, but at the current time, the report I've been presented with, which is a rigorous report, I'm sure all committee members have read it in detail, looks very thoroughly at the question paper, at the marking guidelines, at how that was applied.
What would that trigger be if a teacher contacts you tomorrow to say, here you go?
I'm more than happy to hear concerns from many of Scotland's teachers. They routinely contact me on a daily basis, Mr Briggs, so I'm more than happy to engage with them. That's also why, on the back of the report publishing, whilst I have accepted the findings, and incidentally, I don't think any member in the room today has found any issue with the findings of the report, I was keen to hear from SATH. I think that's reasonable for me as Cabinet Secretary to say, OK, I accept the findings from this report, but I do want to hear from Scotland's history teachers about where we go next and their views. I think that's a pragmatic approach to take. If Mr Briggs has any further information, I'm more than happy to hear that.
Thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
Just to be clear, as a committee member, I challenge the findings of this report, because I think if the pool has not been wide enough to get information to form this report, if you only speak to the people who are going to agree with you, you will come up with a report like this. If you cast the net wider, then I think you may get more recommendations coming into the report. So just... Yes,
with regards to how we feel about the report.
Yes, John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, just probably a few points to add on to what's been said. I mean, Ross Greer's line of questioning as to what might be the explanations, one was that candidates are being entered before they're ready. Another was possibly falling standards of literacy. Is that a possibility?
Well, I'll give... Obviously, the report makes that comment, and that's a comment that's been made, I think, from one of the teachers, one of the markers. So it's an observation from somebody who marked this year's exam scripts. It's not for me to comment on that, but that is a reason that's been put forward in the report, and Fiona may want to say more on that.
I think there's some emerging evidence from markers, and not just in history, but in other areas where we're expecting extended pieces of writing that some learners, not all learners, because we still see excellence from learners, but that some learners are struggling are perhaps struggling more than previously. And history would be one subject where you might see that that play out, because we are expecting extended pieces of writing.
I mean, on that leads me on to my next question, because the idea that some subjects are perhaps affected by different issues, and the suggestion is also made that there's more variation in humanities subjects than there might be in maths or something. Is that the case?
The report highlights that, and that's not when I talk about. But when we talk about variability, I think what we're talking about is not so much variability. It's really more about the marking can be more challenging in subjects which are considered to be perhaps more subjective.
Less black and white.
So the marking instructions, for example, for physics or chemistry or maths, quite often short answer questions requiring very specific answers to get the marks. So quite kind of almost quite binary in nature, and that's understood. But what I've set out in my answers to previous questions is the checks and balances that we put in place in the knowledge of that in relation to courses like history. And it's not a unique issue for Scotland. It's an issue that all exam bodies in similar positions to ourselves, and indeed in other sectors, also
I guess we all have
face.
different preferences. That's why I preferred maths and accountancy to history and geography. But anyway, and talking about the marking instructions, it says they were intentionally more detailed this year. Now, was that because it was felt, well, just everything's improving year by year, or was it specifically felt that the marking instructions had really not been adequate in the past?
But I go back to my comment about the fact that the marking instructions are different. I mean, I think there was further exemplification in the markers meetings and in the marking instructions to help teachers mark. It was that simple.
Could I add perhaps that is a request from markers in response to a request from markers as well to provide further detail in marking instructions to give them greater confidence in the consistency of their marking. So that's a direct response to feedback.
Right.
That's, as well as the other factors.
That's right, Kim. Okay, and my final point, thanks very much. It makes the point there was difficulty recruiting markers in some subjects and specifically. I mean, would that might lead me to think, oh, well, people don't have the experience, they're inconsistent. Would that be a wrong assumption?
It would be a wrong assumption. The markers go through training and quality assurance before they go effectively into live marking. It is, however, fair to highlight that in some courses and for some subjects we do have challenges in marking, and sometimes markers withdraw at the last minute for lots of different reasons. So it is challenging, and I just highlight what something that you will all know, but you can imagine we're marking about 1.3 million scripts from the start of the diet to the point at which there's a cut-off, which at the beginning of, in some cases at the beginning of June. So it's done in a very concentrated, time-defined period of time. So we need all markers to be with us through that. I think the report does highlight that there were some issues with markers, but no, it was not significantly different to other courses or any other subjects that we are dealing with.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, Willie Rennie. Quick one. If you had your time again, or if these exact circumstances were to happen again, would you commission a fully independent report rather than an internal one which was externally verified? Would you do it differently?
In the opening statement that I didn't provide, I mean, the first point was really about the discussion about SQA carrying out the review, and that has been a core criticism, if you like. I mean, the simple answer to why we carried out the review is that it's our job. Now, in the context of what the Cabinet Secretary has said, and indeed in the committee's consideration of the Education Scotland's bill, that's something that you'll want to consider. And indeed, when I appeared before the committee in September, I think it was in response to a question that you asked, I said there's a choice about how and where the regulator sits, what it does. I mean, the regulator at the moment in Scotland doesn't do national qualifications at all. It is self-regulated. So there are some choices about that. So rather than highlight whether this should have been done independently or not, I think if anything, this gives rise to a consideration of future arrangements, because I know that we all want, and I certainly want there to be public confidence in our education system and public confidence in our qualification system. And if the arrangements that are in place, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, do not give rise to the kinds of questions that have been asked today, then I think there is a legitimate question about the arrangements that are in place. However, I think it's really important that I highlight that everyone involved in this review has acted with the utmost integrity, and I fully stand by this report. So on that basis, I suppose the very short answer to your question is no, I'm content with the report and how it's been undertaken. But if the public confidence piece or the confidence of this committee is such that there's another structural issue that needs to be considered, then that's obviously a matter for you and for the Scottish Government to consider.
Okay, thank you. Well, on that point, and we've got to watch our time because we're not allowed to sit while Parliament is sitting in the chamber, so we only have a few more minutes and committee's got other business. So I would have liked more time on this, but I appreciate the time you've given today. Genuinely, that is appreciated by the committee. Given what you've just said, Ms Robertson, to Willie Rennie, if you are so confident in this report and the findings are very clear and categorical, why not say, well, let's have an independent review, a wholly independent review, which will then surely just confirm everything that was in the internal review that was externally verified, would surely then just be copied into a wholly independent review that would have the trust of teachers, of students, of markers?
I have undertaken this work in line, as I've just said, with the responsibilities that I have, and I stand by the report's conclusions.
But what would bar you from having a wholly independent review?
I think that there is nothing to stop either myself or indeed the Cabinet Secretary commissioning an independent review.
Is it something you will both take away to consider following today's committee?
However, I mean, what I said at the start of the discussion today was that we were keen to ensure that the evidence led us to whatever conclusions were required. I don't think, on the basis of the report and the conclusions of the report, that further investigation is required.
But an independent review could speak to people who haven't been spoken to compile this review, and could therefore come up with slightly different recommendations. All I'm asking is that something you will consider and the Cabinet Secretary will consider in light of the evidence and the discussion we've had here today as a committee. Is that something you can at least consider? Ms Robertson.
I'm satisfied with...
So you will not consider that? It's a straightforward question. I do need an answer on this.
Well, it's something that I can take away as feedback from this committee
and consider
in conversation with the Cabinet Secretary.
And consider. I don't know what's difficult with that. Just to consider what
I'm happy to do that, but I think I also need to make clear what I've said in relation to the conclusion of the review and my satisfaction with the conclusion of the review on the basis of the evidence presented.
Yeah.
And therefore, I do not consider an independent review to be necessary.
Could I also make a point, please, about the evidence that was gathered for the review? An increasing amount is being made of the fact that we didn't speak to anybody beyond the people who were most closely involved in setting standards for higher history this year, and the fact that we didn't speak to learners, we didn't speak to other teachers. The starting point for the review was that we did listen to learners, we did listen to teachers, we did listen to others who expressed concerns about the standards set in higher history. That was the evidence that gave rise to the review. The review set itself a number of questions to answer, and those are set out very clearly in the report. The fundamental question being, was the standard set in higher history different this year to last year? In any review of this sort, having set that question, we then need to determine what evidence will help us to determine whether that will help us to answer that question. Myself and my colleague who worked most closely on this report have considered what evidence we needed. The evidence that we needed came from the process of setting standards for higher history this year. Had we gone to speak to teachers and learners, we would have heard concerns expressed that led to the review in the first place. So what we needed was not more of that evidence, we needed the evidence of the standard setting process. We listened very...
This is why, Mr Weir, this is why I believe, and this is a personal opinion, that an independent review, because you're using a lot of we's and what we think there, I think it would have been better if you'd assembled that evidence in construction of this review. Cabinet Secretary, thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
As you've heard today, Convener, the evidence base of the report I don't think has been in contention today. I've not heard that from members, but what I have said is I'm happy to hear from history teachers. I did that through my engagement with SAS already, but I put that on the record again today. I'm very keen to hear from them directly on this issue. The evidence base I've been presented with today, though, we've discussed throughout today's session, does not tell me of the challenges you've spoken to today, Convener, and it doesn't necessarily reflect some of the other views that you have heard. However, I do not discount those views, and I'm more than happy to hear from those teachers.
Thank you. And just finally, Ms Robertson, can I read you two quotes from teachers? I have never been so demoralised about the state of history at SQA level. The second one, writing in the Herald, an experienced teacher said this: what we have recently experienced with the SQA has been nothing short of a national scandal. Will you apologise for this?
Those are the views of two teachers who I'm sure are concerned about the performance of their learners. I think what the report highlights is the variety of views, and what we've sought to do is to take forward an evidence-based report which cuts through perception, cuts through opinion, and ensures that learners have got the right result, and that's been my focus. I'm quite happy to apologise if something has gone wrong, and I'd be very happy to do that. But we undertook the review to see if anything had gone wrong. There are some recommendations and there are some improvements that we can make, but I think it's really important that we cut through some of the commentary, some of the anonymous commentary, and ensure that we make sure, with the responsibilities that we have to learners, we make sure that our attention is ensuring that they get the right results. And
well, of course, some anonymous commentary is whistleblowing, which is crucial to make sure we get this right for students and for teachers going forward. Cabinet Secretary, Ms Robertson, and your officials, can I thank you for your time today? I believe there may be more issues that individual MSPs may want to discuss going forward, but I am very grateful that you've come to committee to discuss this with us today. I'll suspend for a couple of minutes. Thank you.